For your ears only, for the week of March 3rd, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Axelberth.
For 16 months, the president's been traveling all over the country, holding rallies instead of sitting down with Senate leaders in order to try to forge an agreement over there in order to move a bill. We have moved a bill in the House twice. We should not have to move a third bill before the Senate gets off their ass and begins to do something.
I am not a dictator. I'm the president. So ultimately, if Mitch McConnell or John Boehner say we need to go to catch a plane, I can't have Secret Service block the doorway.
Johnson said, give them the vote. They can do the rest themselves.
If you're hearing this program, the world did not end with the onset of Sequester on March 1st. Indeed, as a blame game continued with Speaker John Boehner and other Republican leaders, President Obama last week backed off a bit on warnings about the pain of across-the-board budget cutting, mistakenly seen as so devastating that any compromise would be better. And sharing the spotlight with what didn't happen in Washington was what did, including the Supreme Court hearing on a key provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, whose importance to African Americans and other minorities was foreseen from the start by then-President Lyndon Johnson, as recounted by his biographer Robert Caro on this show after Obama's first election.
Also last week, the administration and a small army of business leaders joined gay activists in Supreme Court cases against the Defense of Marriage Act and California's Proposition 8, banning same-sex marriage there. And in Chicago, long-distance campaign spending by New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg boosted a gun control advocate who won the Democratic primary to replace resigned Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., now out of psychiatric treatment and awaiting sentence on campaign finance abuses. To review these and other political developments of the week for your ears only, we're joined by David Mark, editor-in-chief of the Politics.com comment website. Welcome to our program.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
For the first time since his re-election, President Obama slipped below 50% in an average of approval polls, albeit just a 49%. Of course, that's still about 10 points higher than the GOP gets. Is he still likely to win the blame game when and if Sequester really bites?
I think the White House feels that they have the upper hand on this, that despite all the tactics and the daily ins and outs, they can still blame Republicans for not being, quote-unquote, fair on being willing to give on taxes, on giving up on tax loopholes for corporations and others. And I think the White House feels this is a longer-term fight and battle that they're willing to stick it out on.
Given that White House position and how the conservative Republicans feel about taxes especially, do you think they can really put this fight aside at the end of this month when the continuing resolution comes up to continue financing the government?
I do, and it seems like they're actually kind of trying to factor in these sequester cuts into a longer-term budget deals. It doesn't seem like either side really has much of a stomach for another protracted fight here. Where I do think the White House has the upper hand is there are a lot of Republicans on record saying they want to close tax loopholes for oil companies, for corporate welfare, for all kinds of other groups. And so the White House can kind of hang that around the neck of the GOP, and I think that's why he's kind of holding out this stubbornly.
And how big a bite do you expect? Some analysts say only about half the $85 billion in cuts would actually be made this year, and many of the government furloughs will only be a day without pay every week or two. Is this the start of necessary downsizing?
It's probably not the smartest way to downsize. Absolutely, government agencies across the board need to be cut. That includes those sacred to the left, and Medicare and social services, also on the right, like the Pentagon. But this just kind of across-the-board cut is probably not the wisest way to do it. But the little secret of this, having spent a lot of time in Washington, is these agencies can move money around from account to account. They can juggle things. We've seen this before in government shutdowns, so it may not be nearly as dire as the administration is making it out to be.
How do you see the political machine coming to grips with what everyone agrees is the biggest deficit builder, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security?
I don't see them coming to grips with it at all. And President Obama touched on this in his rather feisty news conference on Friday, in which he said he would have to take on his own side, congressional Democrats, to get them to come around on any cuts to Medicare, because so far there is no interest in that, even changing the calculations for Social Security, which would be a relatively minor change. Democrats are as dead set against this as Republicans are to raising taxes. So that would absolutely have to be part of a longer-term deal.
Let's turn to the Supreme Court. Even as a statue of civil rights pioneer Rosa Parks was unveiled in the Capitol, conservative justices disdained Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, requiring pre-clearance of any election change. They saw it as a racial entitlement no longer required because black voter turnout is so robust in covered southern states. The administration and its supporters see Section 5 as a continuing necessity, especially given the kind of proposed election changes we saw last year that could have disadvantaged particular areas and voting groups. How do you weigh the arguments?
It certainly seems like the conservative justices were rather skeptical of this, although after several Supreme Court cases, I'm skeptical of saying that they're going to rule one way or another. The real question comes down to the persistence of racism in the South, how much that's integrated into the governing structure. It seems like only a generation or two removed from the civil rights era. It's a bit soon to be removing this, but I think what the justices were getting at is how long do these stay in effect? And that's what I think they'll have to reconcile with and reckon with when they come to their judgment.
What was your reaction to big business and the administration weighing in against the Defense of Marriage Act, which bars certain benefits to same-sex spouses?
Yeah, big business, it's kind of interesting. It's often viewed as this conservative bastion, but in many ways, they're really kind of ahead of the times, particularly on social issues. A lot of these companies have been providing benefits to partners and spouses where gay marriage is legal for some time, years ahead of the rest of the country. So I think they want to be seen as on the right side of history, even though it is not clear at all that the Supreme Court is going to rule on that side.
And what about the case against Proposition 8 in California, which Obama put the administration against last week as well?
Yeah, the administration was very careful how they wrote that brief. They didn't say that gay marriage should be allowed everywhere nationally. They said it makes sense under the California Constitution. It should not have been banned there. And it was kind of a wink-wink, nod-nod situation to the justices to say down the line, not too far down the line, you'll then want to legalize it for the rest of the country. But in other words, legalize it in California, but you don't necessarily have to impose it in Idaho or Alabama just yet.
On gun control, some observers say the Bloomberg spending in Chicago and elsewhere by other pro-control groups can be a real counterweight to the NRA. What prospects do you see at national, state, and local levels?
Yeah, I think certainly in Democratic-leaning districts, in Chicago, suburban Chicago, more than Democratic-leaning, deep blue, the Bloomberg spending had an effect. I'm not sure it was as dramatic as it has been portrayed. The big opposition, the leading opponent to the woman who won, the Cook County assessor, Robin Kelly, is a former Congresswoman, Debbie Halverson, who's lost a series of races. Doesn't have a terrific political track record. So I think this would be better tested in more swing districts, suburban areas. But we'll see. Clearly, the Bloomberg gun control people feel they have momentum on this.
Thank you. David Mark is editor-in-chief of the Politics.com comment website at politics.topics.com. That's politix.topix.com.
Quote from the news, a hostile takeover. That was Michigan Democratic Chairman Lon Johnson after Republican Governor Rick Snyder declared a financial state of emergency in Detroit to permit naming a fiscal administrator, which many in the city's largely black population saw as anti-democratic and others as necessary to maintain essential services.
Next, challenges for the church after Benedict, for your ears only.